Good afternoon, greetings. My name is Thembela. I work for Womaniko Transforming Spaces, an organization that delivers gender transformation services for women to thrive in and out of work. I want to apologize for canceling the meeting earlier. It was just technical challenges that were beyond our control, but I'm glad that you could still make it to this call, even though there are a few of us now because of that change of time. To Sammy, thank you so much for agreeing to give this short talk to us on a systems thinking lens to leadership. Perhaps you are wondering why this talk. The reason why we thought of having this short talk is because of the context in which we are finding ourselves in. It is a volatile and an ever-changing context that is marked by complex challenges. For us who are women leaders, you would know it's even worse, other than the many challenges that leaders generally are faced with. We also are confronted by gendered challenges that intersect with our other identities too. In a recent survey that Womaniko conducted, I think in the past month, one of the biggest challenges that women identified was leading in male-dominated spaces. And of course, that's not a topic that we are going to tackle today, but it's one of the things that, or one of the topics that we are looking at very closely at Womaniko and working with others to unpack what this looks like and what it is that we can do to confront, like those kind of challenges. Going back to the context that I started with, that is complex and volatile. This context in reality requires leaders to find new lenses in order to thrive. And I think one of the biggest things I think we're trying to do, especially with this with this session, is to explore what are the different lenses we can wear to help us make sense of this world we are finding ourselves in, and to also see how we can lead with influence within that context. And of course, one of the lenses we are exploring is a systems thinking lens. And that is why we invited Semi to talk on this, because this is a topic that is very close to him and a topic that I believe right now he's very comfortable talking about. With those few words, I want to welcome all of us. And for those who joined me late, I apologize that we had to postpone the session earlier. But yeah, welcome. And Semi, please introduce yourself in case there are people who don't know you, and go for it.
Thank you, Thembela. Thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to the different people. Really good to see some of my friends we worked together, William. We worked together for a long, long time. Some of my students, Rory Sang and others here, and even those on other platforms that are being shared. Really exciting to see you all, and thank you for joining in. Yeah, Samuel Njenga is my name, and I'm coming to you from Johannesburg in South Africa. And what an exciting moment to be talking about issues of leadership when we see what is happening within the global space, when we see what is happening within organizations, and I'll touch on some of those, especially post-COVID, what is happening in organizations and in society. So Samuel Njenga, I work as a management and leadership consultant, also lecture in business schools, and systems thinking is something that is close to my heart. I'm very evangelistic about systems thinking. So I'm excited to get an opportunity here to talk to us and to reflect around systems thinking. We've just got a few minutes, so I'll just share a few reflections, and maybe then Thembela later we can open up for comments or questions if there are any. And the first one, I think the first thought for me, just starting from where you ended in terms of leadership, is that, in my view, leadership is not a static phenomenon. It's not a static thing of you are a leader or you're not a leader kind of thing. Leadership, for me, seen from a systemic lens, is an emergent property. Is a property that emerges from interactions within a context. So before I jump in to say this person is a good leader or not, or what is leadership or what is not, I need to be able to say in what context. And I think sometimes when we talk about leadership, we tend to talk of it as if it's a static thing called leadership. And you either have it or not. And these are 5 principles of leadership, and you tick them, and then you're a good leader. But then there's a bigger question of in what context. So when I look at the concept of leadership from a systems thinking perspective, I see it as an interaction of an individual with a context, which includes other individuals. And leadership is therefore an emergent property. It's something that emerges from that interaction. It's more or less like what happens when you take a tea bag and you put it in hot water. So if I take a tea bag and I say, is this good tea? You would say, yeah, it's good tea. But then put it in cold water, it doesn't yield the same results. Put it in boiling water, it has different results. And in fact, even the quality of water, the saltiness of water determines the ultimate taste. So that's the one thought that I have around the question of leadership, even as you talked about systems thinking or leadership, systems approach to leadership. And there are 4 areas that then for me become very important when I'm talking about this idea of leadership as an emergent property. The first one is the context, because then we need to be talking about the context in which this leadership is being exercised. So if I'm a leader, in what context? So let's talk about the context. And what is happening in our context at the moment is huge complexity and messiness in our context. If you talk about the context of work, the context in which families are in your case, the context in which women are functioning in, it has become an extremely complex context. And what is this idea of complex? Again, complexity is another of those emergent concepts. It's an emergent factor. Complexity emerges from the interactions of individual parts. So when we talk about something like traffic, what is traffic? Traffic is actually independent drivers who find themselves on a road, but respond to that particular road in their own ways. And their interactions of those independent drivers, many of whom don't even know each other, creates what we call traffic or traffic congestion. So the complexity is a similar thing. Complexity is an interaction of what are seemingly independent elements, but as they interact together, they create more and more complex structures and more elaborate issues. And what's happened with our world, I think, you can talk about post-COVID, you can talk about the emergence of AI, you can talk about Trump and everything else and the tariffs, and then you can even talk about what you are referring to in terms of the gendered elements of work and what happens to a woman who finds herself in a leadership role within an organization. These institutions have become extremely complex. And the complexity is as a result of these multiple interactions, some of them seemingly very innocent. So we find ourselves in a workplace, and I say, this workplace is full of politics. I'm not going to get involved in the politics. But by not getting involved in politics, I'm actually playing politics. because politics is an emergent factor of the interactions of different people. So when I look at the context in which we are operating in and what we are finding in organizations is that there is this complexity that has arisen from the fact that today the world is a totally global village. We are interacting with information from everywhere. We're interacting with people from everywhere. So something happening in one corner of the world is affecting everybody else in other parts of the world where before it wasn't. But there's another element to complexity, and that has to do with perspectives. So the complexity that is found in bees or in ants is different from the ones of human beings, because human beings have a perspective, they have an opinion. So even as I interact with you, it's really my perspectives also interacting with your perspectives, my opinions interacting with your opinions. And so when you look at an organization, you realize it is this crucible of very complex interactions of perspectives, of opinions, of worldviews. And that creates more and more complexity as we go along. So that's the first thing I think I want us to realize, is that even as we talk around leadership within a context, that context also is not static. It's dynamic, it's complex, it's messy, it's turbulent in itself. The second thing arising from this is the failure of modern approaches to managing that complexity. So we're trying to manage that complexity the best way we know how to. And oftentimes what you find is well-intended interventions, well-intended solutions. We try to approach that. So again, if we go to the issue you raised earlier, Thembela, about the question of gender, how do we tend to approach that? How do we try to manage that? We try to manage that with numbers. It's become a numbers game. It's become a policy game. And numbers are good. Policies are good. Having those instruments are good, but they don't tell the real story. They don't tell the real story of what happens in a boardroom, that we still have the Viagra jokes in the boardroom. It doesn't tell the stories of really the fluid stories that, although the numbers may change, it doesn't necessarily talk to the lived experiences of people in that boardroom. So how do we try to manage this complexity that we are talking about? In many cases, we try to manage it in what sometimes are called mechanistic approaches. In other words, we try to think around how can we manage it with structures? How can we manage it with formulas? If we do 1, 2, 3, 4, things will work well and they lived happily ever after. Well, that works well for a machine. But in many cases, it doesn't work well for human beings, because human beings have got a perspective. Human beings have got an opinion. They're not just numbers. So the numbers game works well for complicated situations, not necessarily for complex situations. And the result of that failure is unintended consequences, unintended and undesirable consequences. So I think if I may give an example here, there is an apocryphal example that most people run to, and I'll run to it as well, of what you Google and you'll find it. It's called the Cobra effect. And the Cobra effect talks about how when the British landed in India, they found a lot of cobras. And so the British decided, we will pay the Indian people to kill the cobras. And very soon, the British people were paying the Indian community for the dead cobras, but the cobras were not getting finished in the field. So they went to investigate to find out what is going on. And what they found is that the Indian community had started to farm the cobras, because there's money in this business now. They're farming cobras. So then they decided, this is not working. We're not going to pay for dead cobras. And as a result of not paying, people released their small baby cobras and the eggs and everything else. And the result of it was there was more cobras at the end than at the beginning. What am I illustrating? well-intended interventions that don't really understand how systems work. And when we intervene in kind of a knee-jerk reaction because we want to be seen to be doing something about gender, about diversity, and so on, we give cosmetic attention to issues that are actually much more deeper, much more nuanced, and much more complex and messy. And so we give a numbers game. Let's increase the number of lanes on the freeway, on the highway. But increasing the number of lanes on a highway doesn't necessarily address traffic congestion, and so on. So another big place where we are finding this, for example, is in cost cutting. All across, you'll hear cost containment, cost cutting. But in many cases, what you find is that we cut the cost. We're able to show on a spreadsheet the numbers, and we have saved 20,000 euros or whatever it is of rands. But on the other side, what we don't see and we can't quantify is the impact on morale of staff. What impact is it having on the morale of staff? So we've done something, we've contained something, we can show it on a spreadsheet, but the unintended consequence of that, which tends to be long-term, is maybe even worse than what we had at the beginning. Of particular interest for me is the whole thing about working from home. COVID, everybody works from home because we couldn't meet together. But then we did not change our performance management systems and our reward systems to find out how do we manage people who are working from home? How do we manage people who are working offsite? So we still kept the same measurement and reward systems. 3-4 years down the line, we're finding they're not working. So what are people doing? Companies are resorting to saying people should go back to work. Again, a knee-jerk reaction without thinking what are the unintended consequences of what we are doing. So that's the second point I was making, is that there's a failure of mechanistic thinking. There's a failure of intervening without knowing. So whatever situations we are trying to address, again, we seek to address them without fully understanding how systems work. Let me go to my third point then and try and bring this to systems thinking. So what then do we talk about? How does systems thinking help us? And when we talk about a systems approach to leadership, what does this look like? And systems thinking as a discipline has been around for a long time, especially post the Second World War. As a discipline, there's been a lot of talk around systems thinking. In terms of practice, it has been around even much longer, because when you go to African philosophies like Ubuntu, Ukama, interconnectedness, interdependence, I am because we are, and because we are, I am. You start to find a lot of those in Eastern religion, for example. There was a lot of grounding of elements of holism, interconnectedness, interdependence, and so on. But as a discipline, it's much more towards after the Second World War, that systems thinking emerges as a discipline. And I think for me, to share with those of us on the platform in terms of what does systems thinking look like? For me, systems thinking moves from just seeing linear aspects of A leads to B, B leads to C, to trying to say what happens when they interact together. So a mechanistic approach tends to look at things in terms of cause and effect. A systems thinking approach starts to say, hold on a moment. Let me look at the behavior of the whole. Let me look at the interactions. What happens when your perspective and my perspective interact together? What happens when this aspect and another aspect interact together? So the way I tend to put it, Thembela, is that systems thinking for me is a lens, like you said it. So I've got two kind of glasses on my desk here. One is my reading glasses. If I put these glasses and I'm standing far away, everything is blurry. I can't hardly see a thing, okay? But if I take another pair of glasses, and I put on these ones, whoa, everything is dark. Now, I could start to say, why is a room dark? Guys, can you put on the lights? But it's actually not the room that is dark. It's actually the lenses that I'm using that are informing what I see. And that's why we normally say, you see the world as you are, not necessarily as it is. So systems thinking is a way of looking, a way of seeing, a way of perceiving. It's a lens that we use to be able to look at complexity. Okay. And I think for me, I can finish with these 4 things. I think there are 4 things for me that become very important for anybody who is saying, I'm going to use a systems thinking approach. 4 things. First one is we need to honor the ground on which we walk. We need to honor the ground on which we walk. So when I come into an organization and I'm looking, for example, in your case, I'm looking at gender issues or gender realities, I need to start by appreciating, where is this? This is in South Africa. This is in Malawi. This is in Belgium. Where is this? And I need to respect the ground on which I walk. I need to understand what of the histories of this ground have shaped the realities that I'm saying. And I think part of the problem I'm finding, for example, in the business schools where I teach, is we take shelf curricula and we think because it works in Harvard and it works in Yale, it must work somewhere else. We take some of these approaches to mainstreaming gender, and we have these big terminologies that we use around gender and gender mainstreaming and so on. And we assume because it works in Europe, it should also work in Kenya. Not necessarily. It is, what ground am I on? So I've taken it as a practice now. When I go to a place, I want to walk the ground. I want to understand what, and almost let the ground speak to you. Let the ground, I know that sounds super spiritual, but it's really about understanding what's the realities of the histories of this place, the culture of this place, this context, allowing it to understand me to understand what is this organization like in terms of its grounding, what's its history, where did it come from, what's gone on before this. And you can find that through the stories that people tell. You can find that through the rituals that people have in organizations. Who sits in the boardrooms? What boardrooms? What do those boardrooms look like? What do people have on their walls? Who parks their car next to who? All those are stories that tell a lot about the ground itself. So the first thing I think for me is to honor the ground we walk on. The second thing is to appreciate interdependence. So to look around at interdependence, to understand when this changes, what happens to this? When this changes, what happens to this? So to try and understand interdependence, interrelationships of things. When this happens, this happens. When this happens, this happens. And I look at those interrelationships. And there are tools that we can use for that, like rich pictures, and stories are very good for understanding, and so on. There are many other things we can be able to use around understanding what happens when I move one aspect to another aspect. So I pull away from the situation I'm facing, and I want to understand interdependence in a big aspect. The second thing, or the third thing I want to understand is the multiple perspective. So the first one is to honor the ground. The second one is interdependence. The third one is to engage with the perspectives. Again, you go to organizations and some voices are louder than others or are made louder than others. So which voices are we missing? It's all nice and well to say we consulted people, but having people in a room and consulting them are 2 different things. Because you might have people in a room and they don't talk because some perspectives are more loaded, are more honored in an organization than others. So people tell you what you want to hear. So this aspect of multiple perspectives, being able to see who are the stakeholders here, what's their stakeholding interest and perspectives that they bring to the story. And then the fourth element, so grounding, so walking the ground, honoring the ground, Interdependence is the second one. The third one is engaging with multiple perspectives. And the fourth one for me is critiquing our assumptions, questioning our assumptions. This is much more to do with power as well as blind spots. I want to question what I am thinking. I want to question what I am missing. What are the blind spots in what I'm not seeing? Which voices are missing from around the table and why are they missing? So when I hear a particular narrative, I must not just think that's the narrative. I must be able to question and say, could there be a reason why this narrative is dominant? Could there be a reason why this narrative? So you go to many organizations and they'll tell you all that they're doing for gender diversity and everything else. They'll tell you, they'll show you the statistics. But then you need to be able to sit back and question and say, hold on a moment, what are the assumptions here? What are the assumptions I am bringing into the situation? Because it's nothing like a neutral player. I come in and I bring my own assumptions. So what are my assumptions? And having people who can question those assumptions. I am told that in ancient times, every king used to have what is called a king joker, a king's fool, a Rasputin, someone who is allowed to call names to the king, to abuse the king, and they could not be arrested. They could call the king names, they could say any nonsense, but they would not be arrested. And the idea was the king knew, I'm surrounded by people who will tell me what I want to hear. I need to have someone who can tell me what I need to hear. So those four things, I think, for me, are very important. And then lastly, for me, so if I take us on the journey that we have been from the context, looking at the failure of mechanistic thinking, bringing into that systems thinking as well as leadership, I think for me, the result is that we are going to have more and more people, more and more women, more and more leaders who are what Edwin Friedman calls self-differentiated. They are able to manage their anxiety within anxious spaces in organizations. Thembela, I think we could talk a lot more, but let me leave it there for now.
Thank you, Sammy. Wow. Short session, but very, very helpful. Thank you so much for that. I'm not going to add or take anything out of what you said. And we left with 2 minutes. I don't know whether there's anybody here who want to maybe raise a question with Sammy, or maybe there's something that he had said that resonates with you before we close off this quick session. I must say, though, that I think we need to have a session on that idea of follow-up session on that idea of honoring the ground where I am, just to unpack that a little bit more. And I think I would be more interested as well to listen to that from an African perspective too. Anybody who wants to say anything? William?
I wonder if Sammy can give us some guidance on how can we be brave, because we may be aspiring leaders rather than leaders, and what you're asking us to do is to challenge a hierarchy that probably prefers the mechanistic route where they can control things.
Yeah, and thank you, William. And that's a difficult one because it's this whole thing around courageous leadership. And what does that mean? I think the first one for me is to become aware of our own anxieties. Because if I am able to manage my own anxiety, to understand my own anxiety, so even as I go into that boardroom or as I encounter that particular leader, I'm able to understand and to name my own anxieties. And by just naming them, I'm able to better manage them so that when I go into that session, into that discussion, it's not my own anxieties that are fluttering around and therefore are messing up with the whole situation. They used to say that in the army, officers who run cause the greatest havoc. So how do I, as an officer, walk when there's a bomb, but make others to run or help others to run? So how do I manage my own anxiety? I think is the first one. I think the second one is forming coalitions. I think some of these issues are such that they are not for lone rangers. It's how do we form communities of practice? How do we form coalitions that together we can be able to work towards change? Yeah. So that's a quick response. I think there's a lot more we could say about that.
Thank you, Sammy. Sama?
Thank you, Thembela. Thank you, Sam. It's a very interesting topic, and one who, as we engage with the subject of this nature, you realize that unconsciously we have been practicing systems thinking, and you touched on it when you mentioned Ubuntu. You know, but my question, it's linked to what Thembela said. And you mentioned a very profound statement when you talk about the critical principles, the four critical principles of honoring the ground on which one walks on. But I guess we have to go back to basics. And the gentleman that just asked the question before me is, now that I am capacitated about the systems approach and I know about it, how do I embody it? Because I'm going to go to spaces of which they are just going to think I'm smoking something else when I start talking about systems thinking. How do I introduce the concept, taking into account that it's something that people, they are afraid of what they don't know, you know, and I'll be talking to people who have no idea what I'm talking about, and they will think, this is philosophical, this is MPA or whatever that you have learned, but it's not practical. But how do we embody as people that now we're going to walk in situations and we're going to be start saying, and let's think about systems. How do we do that?
Yeah. Thanks, Zama. And wow, again, very complex, like William's question, very complex questions in themselves. I think that for me, the more I've studied and worked in systems thinking, the more I'm thinking, I don't actually like the concepts. I don't like the concept of systems thinking. It's just that I haven't been able to come up with something maybe better, because systems thinking, already when you say systems, people think cogs and machines, but also systems thinking as a concept is very westernized. It's very, it doesn't speak to the fluidity that we're talking about, for example, in this session. And so increasingly for me, it's become more about the practice more than the concept. So can I be able to live out those principles, even if I don't call them anything? It's the same like a concept like Ubuntu. Ubuntu has become misappropriated and misused, and now everything is a Ubuntu, even Ubuntu coffee shop, Ubuntu tire and wheels and everything else. So how do we live it out, even if we don't use the concept? I think that is my challenge at the moment.
I'm actually glad.
And then let me just also add, and then to the second thing I was saying to William about, that's why we have this kind of conversations, that for me, it's also about building momentum with more and more people who are more and more like-minded in these things. Yeah. Sorry, Thembela.
Yeah, I was just saying, I'm so glad that Zama is asking that question, because for me, I always find that with all these concepts, whether you're talking about gender, which I started talking about, we always come up with terms that disempower us, and and make it difficult for us to engage with what is in front of us, because we are so caught up in the terminology. And I remember that when our son was asked once to talk about what the father did, he said his father makes people to play so that they can think. And so it's such a nice practical thing that talks about real life and away from the concepts. Yet, if you think about it, I mean, if we didn't have stories, with us, that boy would not have been able to even explain what the father does. But for him, it was such a practical thing of we play so that we can think. Yeah. So I don't know if I'm looking at the time, it's 12:35. I know that I have to run. I also know that Semi has to run as well. And yeah, this was a short session, but very powerful. Thank you, Semi. And thanks everyone for coming. We will be sharing more information about more of these sessions. I think we'll try and sort out our tech issues so that we don't cancel any more sessions, because we want to have more of these. And as Semi had said, we want to take these seemingly difficult concepts and make them as practical as possible. Because for us, when we asked Semi to come and talk to us about this, it was really more to help us think about how do we look at our context in the area where we work, and be able to, instead of just using a narrow lenses, but really help us think about more holistic ways of making sense of our world in which we live, so that we are able to thrive and not be overwhelmed by what we see in front of us. On that note, thank you so much, everyone. Hope you have a good day ahead of you. I don't know whether we are all in South Africa or in different places, but thank you so much. Please look out for more information from us. We'll be sharing details about other sessions that we will have, so that we can tap into that knowledge that Semi has. Thank you. Thank you, Semi. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.